Hello, everyone. My clock on my computer here says 4 o'clock, so I thought I would get us started. If you're in the hall, feel free to come in. I'd rather you be comfortable than sit somewhere randomly in the hallway. My name is Laura Egan. I am the head of collection strategies at the University of North Dakota, and I'm speaking today on executive services, making your library's impact visible to administrators. And a shout out to my library dean who suggested this topic as I was reflecting on what to present or submit for the Charleston conference. So I hope you find this helpful. And as you know, this is the code of conduct for the Charleston conference. As I've been reflecting on the sessions I attended today, one thing I've been thinking about is that historically, as the speaker this morning talked about, libraries have been centered on collections. However, that has changed over time, and he also mentioned that term collection strategist has become more popular, which is, as I said, my title, head of collection strategies. So I've been thinking about that and where this presentation fits in, and I think part of that is how can we take our collections expertise and apply it so that we have an impact on our institution's administrators. So a few areas I'm going to talk about in relation to that are licensing, data, and services. One of the themes for my presentation is to know your value. And I think part of that is that we have this expertise, we apply it within a certain realm, but we don't always think about how it can be useful in other realms, so in this case, for administrators. And I'm hoping that this session will help us as a group think about new applications for our skill sets as librarians. Another theme for my presentation is real-world application. I want us to think about our skill sets, but I also want us to go back from this conference and apply some of those great ideas we've come up with so that we have time to digest what we're thinking about today and bring that back to our institution and actually apply it. So thinking about licensing. Ebook licensing, that's something we're all, at least if you're a collection librarian, very familiar with. It's something we do all the time. We have a great program for students, for faculty, for researchers. But what about administrators? So when I became involved with procurement, I started working with our university's vice president of finance. And she learned more about what the library does and what we can do. And one thing that she came to me with was, hey, could you license ebooks so that we could use them to help train our procurement officers? That was not something I thought about before. That was not something she had thought about before until she knew that this was something that we could do. And as I started working more with our procurement services, I was also finding that all kinds of departments were buying books, sometimes for a book club, sometimes for events, and they didn't think to reach out to the library as a place that could license these ebooks for us. So that's one area I realized that we could be reaching out to other administrators on campus and saying, hey, if you're interested in a book for this book group or this training purpose or this type of professional development, that's something that we can look into licensing for you. And you may run into that issue of them coming across something on Amazon that you can't actually license for ebook use, but there's other ones that you can license. So another example of that, I found out that our College of Engineering and Mines was doing a book group on brain rules for work. And part of that addresses how do you work virtually, and of course this was partially related to the COVID era, and provide good teamwork in that environment. And so this was something that was obviously helpful for them, for their book group, but also for our university and thinking about now that we have these hybrid meetings, how do we have these meetings be impactful in this new environment? So as you are reaching out to partners, some things I was thinking about what other roles might be offering training in our universities, so obviously academic advising, things like research and economic development, alumni relations, campus counseling. So one thing I'm going to have you reflect on in a bit is what areas might find this useful in your institution. So another thing you might run into is a request for a Chronicle of Higher Education report. And if you are involved in the Northeast Regional Library Consortium, great, they have some sort of package where you can get a couple of these reports as part of your license. They don't offer everything through that, And so something that we used to do is we would buy print copies and put them on reserve, and then people could check them out. But you can actually license these for online access. And so I, through emailing various contacts, found out that you can email solutions@chronicle.com and request a quote and license agreement based on your institution's FTE. Now, one reason that this I find is helpful is that these reports often address issues that are challenges our administrators are facing. And so this provides a way for us as librarians to provide a service that's helping them problem solve at an institutional level. Another area that I've run into is licensing standards. That's another one that can be complicated, especially if they just want a specific standard. And we have a ESTM Compass package, and they more recently have started offering some smaller options of standards. And so we were able to do some specific requests through them, especially now that TechStreet doesn't do that. I used to be an engineering librarian. Anyways, so some things that we've been able to help with are facilities. They were looking for standards related to handicap accessibility. And again, that was another partner that I hadn't thought of before. Facilities, they care about standards. Another one was our Office of Safety. So they provide ergonomic assessments for campus, and that was a standard they were interested in, is one related to ergonomics. So there may be some other areas in your institution that you're not thinking about as partners that could actually really benefit from your expertise in being able to license resources. This one was actually mentioned in the last session, so business data sets. And similar to them, we said we can't pay for all these business data sets, but we can help negotiate your contracts. And so that's another area that I realized that we as collection development librarians have a lot of expertise, licensing. And it might be business data sets, it might be something else, but we know how to work with vendors, we know how to work with our university's procurement system. In my case, I'm also at a state institution, so I have to work with all our state regulations and processes, which take a long time. And I know how to negotiate all of that. So something we were able to do in this case is have meetings with some of these different vendors and the business school and talk about our needs and figure out some deals. So in some cases, that was the usual multi-year agreement. In one case, we said, hey, this other institution in our university system's interested in joining. Could we get a discount if they also joined? And we were able to get a discount for both of us doing that. So some of those negotiation strategies that you are probably familiar with as collection development librarians are something that the rest of the university doesn't have that kind of experience with. So that's another area where we can provide value as collection development librarians to other areas of campus. So I'm going to give breaks throughout the session to have you reflect on what I'm talking about. This is going to be the first one. And as a heads up, the first two are more individual reflection, and the third one is going to be more of a small group reflection and share out. So the first one, thinking about who are your potential stakeholders for the examples so far. So I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to jot down some ideas that maybe jumped out to you from the examples I gave. And if you didn't already know who to contact for that particular unit in your campus, I would like you to look up that on your phone to see who it would be that you would potentially contact. So some examples I gave were procurement, faculty affairs, the VP of research for the different colleges, and also thinking about facilities and our safety office. So go ahead and take a couple minutes and think about who you might be able to offer these services to that we just talked about. So I mentioned earlier, I don't want you to just leave this session and forget about it. I want you to actually apply something from it. So I'm also going to have you do a brief accountability with someone next to you. And I'm going to have you share business cards or contact information with that person, and then tell them that I will connect with at least one of these potential stakeholders when I get back from this conference. So do that. I love that you're already excited about what you're going to do when you go back from this conference. So I'm going to give you some more time to talk later. Let's get back to the second section, which is focusing on data. So the second section is thinking about data, and this is another area where, as collection development librarians, we love our data. We collect a lot of data. I also, in my position, provide information for the ACRL report. Perhaps others of you do ARL reporting, and sadly, the iPads is no longer going to require the library portion. So we'll see how that goes. But anyways, so another thing that I've been learning about is that our data that we collect can also be useful in a number of other contexts. And some of it might be measures you're already communicating, like cost per use, or where your faculty publish, or which journals they cite. And I've been finding that administrators not only want to know that their money is being well spent, but they also want to communicate that to their stakeholders. And in our case, as a state institution, that also includes our State Board of Higher Education and legislatures, and even voters. So one example that I put together is library support highlights for each college in our institution. And part of why I started doing this is that our institution uses the MIRA funding model. So effectively, our budget is divided amongst participating colleges based on student headcount. And every December, our dean presents to their deans and the provost our budget, and essentially they say, yay, nay, here's how much you're getting. They pay our bills. So one thing that these do is that they reinforce to each college, hey, this is what's happening with your investment. And I think some things that were interesting to me in putting these together was that we looked at which packages had the most top journals for different colleges. And unsurprisingly, Science Direct showed up in most of those. And another thing that we noticed, and they noticed, besides the usual, hey, journals are expensive, is that we weren't spending very much on books. Of our whole collections budget, only 2% was going to books. And our College of Arts and Sciences said, hey, you should be spending more money on books. And guess what? They gave us more money to spend on books. So I'm happy to spend more money on books. So as I put on this slide, the report sections we included were journals, databases, books, services, and staffing. If you're like a lot of libraries, about half of our budget goes to content and about half to our staffing. And I also included in these reports that X% goes to journals, which unsurprisingly was most of it, and then databases, books, etc. And another thing that showed me is that where we could invest more in open access agreements. So when we started these reports, we had, I think, one read and publish agreement through Lyrasis, and now we have 5 read and publish agreements. And so now I'm able to add a statistic to say that X% of your top journals you can publish open access in at no additional cost to yourself. And that's another statistic that they're really like right now with the Nelson memo, or whatever the new version of that is they called. And like I mentioned before, actually all of this was data that we were already using for something else. So the ACRL data, our budget, digital measures, which is what our institution uses to track faculty publications, journal citation reports, or for the College of Business and Public Administration, their specific journal quality report, and Alma Analytics reports, which we are an Alma Primo institution. So that's where we pulled in our SUSI data for counter stats as well as our circulation stats. So another group that is a stakeholder for us is our University Senate Library Committee. And this is another one where thinking about the data that we collect and the story that we can tell that would be impactful to them resulted in 4 different presentations. So one was specifically about how we use data as well as our expertise as librarians to make decisions about collections. Another one was forecasting price increases for library subscriptions. This pulls from the EBSCO 5-year average price increase. Updating the budget for ebook and book budget formula. So I mentioned earlier, Arts and Sciences said, hey, you need to spend more money on books. And we said, okay, but if you want us to spend more money on books, one area we should invest is more ebooks because those get more usage, but they also cost more money. And so that was something that was interesting both for us and I think also for them to look at that data. Another one was our Association of College Research Libraries annual survey highlights, and I've been finding it helpful to compare, here's where we're at this year versus the previous year. And one statistic I've been finding interesting is that increase in digital usage. And they actually found that interesting too, as I'll talk about in a little bit in the next slide. And another thing I found helpful, and of course this is going to depend on where your institution's budget is at, is so that price increase report, and we all know this as collection librarians that prices go up every year. So if they don't increase your budget, you have to cut stuff. And this really told that story to them to say, hey, over 5 years, journal prices went up 18%. So if you expect us to get the same stuff, like, you need to increase our budget. And if you're like many libraries, for years and years, we had a huge deficit because they did not increase our budget, and we canceled things, and they were not happy. And they finally increased it. Slowly over several years, but that was amazing. So another target audience for your data are administrators involved with your institution's strategic plan. And so I mentioned that data point from the HL report about the increased digital usage, and I actually found that that was helpful for our institution's strategic plan. I met with one of our co-chairs for our strategic planning efforts at the university level, and he had all kinds of ideas just based on that data that I showed him from those presentations I gave University Senate. So besides that one that he talked about as relevant for promoting digital technology, he also realized that the data that we had on community patron checkouts could be a way that we could track our service to the community. And I think one thing that showed me is having this type of conversation can again show you how your library actually can have a bigger impact than you maybe realize. And so I think sitting down and having some of those conversations with stakeholders like your chairs of your institution's strategic plan, even if it's just to show them, hey, here's the type of data I have, is this useful to you, that this can be a way you can really make a big impact on your institution. This one is probably a data point you're already sharing. And one thing that I found interesting was that our provost actually mentioned this when we had some sort of event at our alumni center and there was legislatures in the room. And later in that same event, I heard the legislators talking to each other about this number, about how much we save students through our affordability initiatives, such as open educational resources. And to me, that was really exciting, that this was a statistic that, yeah, this is a good statistic. Legislatures cared about it because to them, this was something they could communicate back to voters. And again, as a state institution, that was something that we could say, hey, here's one way we're helping keep costs low for students. And another area they also care about is workforce skills development. So that's another data we'll have to figure out how to show, but I think this is another one that can help your institution's administrators make that case to their higher-ups in your State Board of Higher Education or your legislature. This is probably another statistic you're already sharing, and as I mentioned earlier, our college reports, one thing that we started looking at was how much we saved that college through our read and publish agreements, because instead of them or their faculty paying the APCs, it was covered through our read and publish agreement. So that was one data point that we started collecting. And then the other one is the impact of our open access articles. And this I thought about in terms of, again, that showing that impact to our state, because they want to know how is the money going into our university making an impact on our state. And so by making those research articles open access, now everyone in our state can read them. And I thought it was also interesting that our citations were higher, surprisingly perhaps, for the articles that were open access. So that's another way to show that impact that your university's research is having in the broader world. So second reflection point, thinking about the data that you collect, what might be of interest to administrators at your institution? And again, thinking about that stakeholders list, or perhaps some other people I mentioned, like your institution's strategic planning team, who could you reach out to set up a meeting to discuss what might be helpful to them? So take a couple minutes and think about that. So the last section, and then we'll have more time to talk, is rethinking services. One area is our institutional repository. And I mentioned to someone earlier, we had our head of technical services retire after more than 55 years. And yeah, Shelby Harkin, if you knew her from ALA committees. And so in the meantime, Zainab Youssef, our head of digital initiatives, and myself are co-interim directors for our technical services area. And through this process, I've been learning a lot more about what she does with our institutional repository, because obviously some things we've been thinking about are the metadata side, and also thinking about what we should preserve or could preserve for our future community, as well as to make a broad impact. And in those conversations, a couple of areas I learned about were that we could host journals on our institutional repository, and we could also host conference materials. I put up a couple of examples. The Circadian, which is a brand new publication as of 2025, and our UND Writers Conference, which has actually been going on for more than 55 years at this point. And there's actually some really great recordings of older conferences that we are trying to figure out rights to see if we can put them online. So you might be running into that as well. But anyways, so thinking about that more broadly, what sort of conferences does your campus host? What sort of publications might you host or offer to host? And in those conversations, we've also been thinking about different services that we could offer to campus. So thinking about student organizations, about colleges, about campus events. And part of that conversation has been dealing with, hey, so if they had a speaker forum for this writers conference that would give us permission to put this on our institutional repository, that would make things a lot easier. And so starting some of those conversations is helpful. And there's other examples. For example, I mentioned our university as president was a keynote speaker recently at a state event. And we realized, is this content being preserved anywhere? And we thought about, hey, this would be a good example of something we could host on our institutional repository, so that 20 years down the road, this is something that our state can still look back at to see the impact that we're making and to the broader world. And I think this is also relevant for student poster sessions. And actually, our digital initiatives librarian mentioned that one thing they did is they would have a competition for these type of events. And the, I think, top 3 would also get some editing services. So if you are concerned about the quality of the content your students put out, that could be an option to make sure that they have good grammar and are citing their sources. But I think part of why this is an executive service is that it's showing that we can preserve what our institution is doing now for that 20 years down the road. So it's not just something that happened here and now, but it's something that when our current students have kids that are perhaps attending our institution, they can say, hey, this is something I was involved with. And now the Alumni Center is happy because now this student who now is graduated and has a student is perhaps a potential donor. And they can say, oh, this money I'm giving helps support things like this. So I think it helps me think more broadly about how our institutional repository can provide impact ongoing for our institution. So another example, this is actually a dashboard for our College of Education and Human Development, and it gives downloads by region for the publications that they have in our institutional repository. And there's actually more data than this particular slide, but I think this is also really helpful because it shows that this particular college can tell their administrators that this is the impact our college is having. And it's really interesting to see how that is affecting the whole world too. It's not just North Dakota, it's actually having an impact across the globe. So the last area that I wanted to highlight is literature reviews for administrators. And in a way, you could think about this as an extension of that Chronicle of Higher Education example. So a lot of times our administrators have these issues that they are trying to deal with, and they want to get ideas about what are other people doing, what is the research out there. And as librarians, one of our skill sets is finding information. In this case, the service initially came about because our State Board of Higher Education essentially promised our legislator a post-tenure review plan. And your states may have undergone a similar push for post-tenure reviews, so you know how fun that is to deal with. And as you might expect, our administrators were scrambling to prepare for these potential new requirements. And in that conversation was our library dean, and she offered our services to help. And as part of that collaborative effort, I was tasked with conducting a literature review on faculty productivity post-tenure. The deliverables were a one-page executive summary and an annotated bibliography. And they liked what I provided so much that they said, hey, could you do another one, this time on faculty recruitment and retention? I'm still working on that annotated bibliography. But I learned a lot from this particular effort, and I think we've been talking a bit today about different AI tools, so I thought I'd mention briefly some of the ones that I experimented with here. And I still found that I spent a lot of time using our citation analysis tool, Web of Science, but I did also find Cite helpful for introductory point, and it was interesting. The last session, or 2 sessions ago I was in, they were talking about how you tell, so it's not just about citations, but it's also how those citations talk to each other. And one thing that I find interesting about Cite is that it'll tell you, is this cited in support of something else, or is this saying that, oh, this is garbage, don't listen to it, and it also includes that information on retractions and so forth. So that I found interesting as a good starting point. I also found that I really liked Undermined, and one thing that I liked there is that they actually use citation analysis in their tool. So even though they're relying on open access resources, they can look at their citations and make a guess based on that for what else might be relevant for your search. And when I compared what I found from my own searching to what they ranked as most likely to be relevant, I found their top results were pretty on par with my top results. They found things I missed, I found things they missed. But again, I found that actually a really helpful starting point. So I recommend those tools, but it just still takes a lot of time. So this is the fun part, where we get to break up into groups. And you could talk to the same people that you were already talking with, or find some new people. And I want you to think more about what is your library already doing that you can market as an executive service? What additional expertise, data, or resources do you have or could acquire that would benefit your institution's administration? And what are some ways you could package that as an executive service? So talk about this in groups. So our session is almost over, so I wanted to pull this back together. So before you leave today, I would love for you to pick at least one service that you came up with or a stakeholder you identified to meet with. And as we talked about earlier, I want you to commit to actually going and trying this out or talking to somebody that you came up with. And since I believe at time, in summary, the two themes I highlighted at the beginning of this presentation was to know your value and real-world application. I provided some examples of how we can apply our expertise to benefit our institution's administrators. We also hopefully had some good conversations with people around us to come up with some additional ideas. And as you leave today too, I want you to keep thinking about what are you good at in your role as a librarian, and what are our administrators' needs, and what problems are they trying to solve? Because I think as we realize that our skill sets can be really helpful to help our administrators solve those problems, then that's where our services can really make a big impact. So thank you.